Hi folks, Matt Easton here. So, as some of you will know, for quite a few months I have been involved in working with the HEMA shop, a UK based company, on developing a new gymnasium sabre. That is a practice version of the military sabre for use in HEMA and historical fencing. Before I go on and actually review and talk about this specific weapon, which this is an example of, and in fact you can see this in use in some of my sabre videos, before I go on and talk about this, I'm going to talk about its predecessors. Okay, so what we started out using in terms of steel practice sabres was the Hanwei Hutton. The Hanwei Hutton is been incredibly widely used around the world for military sabre fencing. It is better than a sports sabre. It is closer to being like a proper gymnasium sabre. However, it suffers from a range of problems and issues and really annoying things which mean that I would not recommend anybody to buy a Hanwei Hutton, and I think basically you should throw these in the bin as soon as you can afford to and buy one of these new sabres, but I'll talk about that as I go along. So the main issues with the Hanwei Hutton are, firstly, the blade is essentially too light. Okay, that's not to say it's too light compared to all gymnasium sabres that existed in the past. There were some types of light gymnasium sabre that did exist and were used, particularly in Italy, and towards the end of the Victorian period and beginning of the 20th century in Britain and France and Hungary and various other places as well. However, for what most people want to do with a military sabre training weapon, that is looking at the popular you know, British or American or French sabre sources, they're looking at military sabre use. The Hanwei Hutton is essentially a bit too light and has its mass in the wrong places. So the blade's a little bit light. It's also a little bit short at about 31 inches. That's not incredibly short by sort of global standards. There were certain French infantry officers' swords, for example, and American infantry officers' swords which only had 31-inch blades, and in fact Royal Navy officers' swords tended to only have 31-inch blades as well. And cutlasses of course only have about 27-inch or 28-inch at most blades. However, again, for what most people are looking at, you know, these sources like Hutton and Waite and Burton and Angelo and things like this, the blade's a little bit on the short side, so it's a bit short and it's a bit light. Okay. Next up is the point of it, and you can see the point there. The point of the Hanwei Hutton is essentially a point. Which is really stupid for a practice weapon. It's not pointy, it's not sharp, however it is rounded, and I can guarantee you that if you stab someone who's not wearing adequate protective gear with that, it will go into them. With the result that lots of people have found this so nasty to use for thrusting that they've either ruled out thrusting in their practice or sparring, or indeed I've been in a competition where thrusting was disallowed with these weapons. Or they've had to go and add their own sort of blunt tip on the end there to make them safe for thrusting. And added blunt tips have all sorts of issues of their own. They add mass at the end of the weapon where you don't really want it. They tend to get stuck on things, they sometimes fall off, they look stupid, and so on. Okay? So overall, the blade, kind of the shape of it is fine, but it's a bit short, it's a bit light, and it's got a silly point for a practice weapon. Okay? The hilt kind of looks okay, but suffers from a number of issues as well. First of all, you'll see from this example, a very well used example from one of my students. I should point out this isn't my weapon. I got rid of my Hanwei Hutton about a year ago. I gave it to someone to get rid of it because I didn't want to look at it anymore because it's a horrible thing. The guards, okay? Yes, on the latest generation of Hanwei Huttons, the guards have been thickened up and they are slightly better. However, they're still a bit crap, okay? And generally speaking, they're made of too thin steel, and it gets all bashed and bashed out of shape and ends up looking like the lunar surface, full of craters and looking like a very strange shape there because they just get bashed a lot. Okay, so the guard is too thin, And I would also say it's kind of not a very nice shape. It kind of sits quite far away from the hilt considering how wide the grip is, which is the next point I come on to, and that is that the grip of the Hanwei Hutton is very, very thin. Now this does correspond to the narrowness and lightness of the blade. They're looking at a late period gymnasium sabre, a light gymnasium sabre. So I don't have a big problem with that. However, what happens in reality, much like this one, is that lots of people using Hanwei Huttons end up wrapping the grip to make it thicker, because it's a little bit too thin for most people's hands. I actually prefer a relatively thin grip, so I haven't had a huge problem with the Hanwei Hutton grip, but lots of people do, and lots of people end up wrapping it with tennis tape or golf club tape, all sorts of things. Okay. Next up is that the nut on the end was forever coming loose, and the whole weapon becomes very jangly and loose and rattly the whole time, and it's just pretty much horrible. Okay. Final two problems with it is the next one is the fact that the pivot points are very strange in this weapon. So I've had the pleasure and honour to own lots of antique swords because I buy and sell antique swords. And you get to know how a sword kind of should move, and the Hanwei Hutton does not move like that. There's something really weird, and there always has been. Now, there is lots of variation between individual models of the Hanwei Hutton. Some are better than others, some are heavier than others, some are stiffer than others, and some move better than others. However, generally speaking, and I've probably handled, I don't know, like probably 20 Hanwei Huttons over the years, they all feel a bit wrong in the hand. They just have really weird pivot points that do kind of weird things in the hand. And I won't go into the science of why that is, but the pivot points are in the wrong places as far as I'm concerned. They just feel weird in the hand. Okay, whether you hold it hammer fist or whether you hold it saber grip with the thumb up. Okay, they're not very nice swords. And lastly, the last most important point is quality control. Okay. Hanwei by and large has okay quality control. However, these Huttons, because they're relatively fragile blades, unlike for example the Hanwei practical rapier or the practical longsword, hand and a half sword, which are obviously beefier, bigger swords, and so they can have a bigger margin of error. When you get into these very narrow, more flexible blades, the margin of error is much smaller. And I have seen a number of Hanwei Huttons. This one's not too bad at all, this is actually fairly good. But I've seen a number of Hanwei Huttons that when you flex them, they don't flex evenly in the second half of the blade. They have a particular point at which they bend. In fact, the old one I had was like that. It bent more at one point and it didn't bend evenly. And of course, this is the point at which the blade is going to snap, and it makes the blades more dangerous. They've got very thin tangs, they're not particularly thick steel this way either, and generally speaking, they are just horrible. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about the Hanwei Hutton. Consider this a review, and consider it Matt Easton saying that he hates the Hanwei Hutton and thinks that they're pieces of crap that should be thrown in the bin and consigned to the forgotten annals of history. Okay, we've now got better things. Forget about the Hanwei Hutton. So, what came up next is I started looking for something better. We started focusing in Scholar on military sabre. We'd always done a bit of military sabre because I've got an interest in it, but we were primarily a longsword group, and then we decided to branch out and make the group more 50-50 and focus on military sabre a lot more than we had done in the past. So I decided we needed a better training weapon, and by that point we were using Peter Regenyei's longsword feathers. So, and in fact Peter by that point had already developed a gymnasium sabre with the Swedish guys from Gothenburg, based on the Swedish sabre, Swedish infantry officers' sabre, and the practice versions of it. So basically what I did is I went to Peter and I gave him a load of measurements, and there was some back and forth, and we ended up with this, which is Peter Regenyei's Easton model, named after me of course, model of gymnasium sabre. Now, I have to say, have to be honest, this is mechanically a very good sword, okay? Very, very durable. Peter makes very durable blades, good steel quality. We had a batch of these in my club. Some of them ordered at the same time, some of them ordered individually. and they have performed very, very well, and they're still performing very, very well and will continue to do so. Okay, so there is absolutely nothing wrong with Peter's version of the Hanwei Easton Gymnasium saber. However, Peter had some very definite ideas about what he did and didn't want to do with the saber, and this resulted in it not really being fully my design. It had certain compromises in it, things that I was never fully happy about. But because Peter's got a lot of demand, specifically for his longsword feathers, he has quite a big waiting list. So the two main issues that I had with getting sabres from Peter was the one, I could never really get them to be my design because there were certain things he wanted done his way, which is fine, that's his choice, he's the maker. But secondly, the fact that there had become a long waiting list. And the fact of the matter is that I have a fair number of students and I have a fair number of new people coming through my club, and I want to be able to recommend a sword to them, a training weapon that they can essentially buy off the shelf and get their hands on straight away. So I kind of moved on from, although I reiterate there's nothing wrong with these with Peter Regenyei Sabres at all, and they're very well made, very good steel, we've never had any failures from them, and I know that they're used in swordfish, for example, in Gothenburg as the sort of sabre official weapons, and in fact I have used them as that at fight camp as well. However, I wanted something more to my design, okay, and more available immediately off the shelf, so someone could go on Saturday night, get their credit card out, order it on the internet and have it, you know, for training the next week kind of thing. Okay, so what we ended up with was I completely revised the design, and I actually made the first prototype myself, and that was sent off to the makers that work with the HEMA shop, and it went through several corrections and tweaks, slightly changing the length and the width of the grip, slightly changing it this way versus this way. The guard initially, I wasn't quite happy, it was a bit too far away from the grip, and the further the guard gets away from the grip, the less protective it is to your hand. So we brought the guard slightly in. That also has the advantage of reducing the amount of weight in the guard. We tweaked the end assembly, which is held together with a nut, which I'll talk about in a minute. The blade, pretty quickly we got to where we wanted with the blade actually, but there were tweaks on the hilt. So the long and the short of it is that finally we have the Easton Gymnasium Sabre, or Easton Practice Sabre #1 as it's officially called, which is now available right this minute on the HEMA shop website. This morning it was available to pre-order, now it's available to buy. Okay, they literally arrived in stock today, and I'll upload this video tonight, that being Friday, a few minutes after I finished filming it. Okay, so what are the characteristics of this sabre? It has a 33-inch blade, which is made of 1095 carbon steel, heat treated to between 50 and 55 Rockwell. The blade is designed specifically so that it bends in mostly the final third, exactly like a feather, or indeed like most sharp swords. It bends somewhat halfway along the blade, but mostly in the final third of the blade. It has, very importantly, compared to the Hanway Hutton, it has a rolled, forge rolled tip. That is, the blade there is no extra thing added on. It is simply the blade heat forged round into a loop, so you have no added weight and you have a lovely, smooth, blunt point there that I can very comfortably push with a lot of force into my bare hand, and I'm not hurting myself doing that. Okay, they do thrust, they are fairly stiff blades, okay, they're not very, very flexible blades like some of the practice rapiers you might see. They're relatively stiff, but they're still very safe in the thrust, largely because of that nice round folded tip, but also because they've got just enough give in them to make them safer. Okay, the 33-inch blade, the overall weight of the weapon, they vary between individuals, exactly the same as the Peter Regenyeis and the Hanwei Huttons vary a bit. If you compare them, individual swords between each other, they vary a bit. These do vary a little bit as well, because they are hand forged, and they are forged. They're not, it's not done by stock removal, they are forged by hand, and they vary in weight between about 850 grams and 900 grams. Now I'm aware that on the HEMA shop website at the moment, they might update this, at the moment it says I think 830 grams. Most of the examples that I've weighed, and I've had a batch of 10 and I weighed them all, they all basically came in between 850 and 900 grams, which is good because I was aiming for 880 grams, slap bang in the middle of those. That being the weight of most of my original antique gymnasium sabres, which I've shown in previous videos, and being the weight of an infantry officer's sabre. So in terms of weight and size, this is modelled on the British infantry officer's sword. British infantry officer's sabre. Okay, it's the same length, same weight, same point of balance. It's about 5 inches from the guard. It's got the good pivot points. In my opinion, this has far better handling characteristics than the Peter Regenyei version. That's for various reasons, but the main reason I believe is because the hilt weighs less on this version, but the blade probably weighs just very slightly more. So we've shifted the pivot points around, and you have a slightly better feeling in the blade. I find a much better responsiveness with this sword. And I should point out, I don't get anything, I don't get any commission or anything out of these swords. I'm not plugging it just for the sake of it. I have the Regenyei Sabre and I have the Red Dragon Sabre, and I spar with this every week and train with this and teach and demonstrate with this as a preference. This is for me the better practice sabre, better than the Regenyei one. Okay. The guard, it's fairly simple steel guard as you'd expect. It is folded over on the inwards edge to give extra strength and stability. That is 14 gauge mild steel, so that's as thick as most reenactment helmets would be, for example, and you've got the added fact of that it's essentially double thickness at the edge, which gives a huge structural kind of strength and resistiveness to the guard. Very, very strong guard. The grip is more normal sized, it's more the size of an actual military sword, and that is very comfortable to grip either hammer fist or with the thumb up, and you'll notice the length is very adequate. It's not over long. I don't like over long grips. I want the grip to be just big enough and no more than that, and you can comfortably hold this with the thumb up with one of the new Red Dragon sparring gloves on. You can fit that into that hilt, no problem. Okay, so lacrosse type gloves should be no problem as well. Okay, and in fact I know someone who uses one of the sparring glove, one of the Polish sparring gloves in one of these also. Okay, it is secured with a nut at the end. Now, just to prove that I am relatively impartial in this and that I'm not completely corrupt and I haven't sold out to the man. The one criticism I've got of these swords is very occasionally, and this is the only problem we've yet seen with them at all in use, is very occasionally the nut at the end there, in tightening it, and you don't have to tighten it very often, nothing like as often as the Hanway Hutton, in tightening it, very occasionally the nut is a little bit soft and it takes the thread out of the nut. Not a big problem. All you have to do is go down to the hardware store, and I've done this on mine, and mine was the weapon this happened to, because my weapons had the most use and the toughest use, and just buy a new nylon threaded nut, or self-securing nut, 1/4 inch. It goes straight on there, tightens straight on with a normal wrench, and it stays very tight and rings. Hope you can hear that. Rings like a bell. Okay, it tightens up very, very well and stays tight for a long time. But if it does loosen up, it's very easy to tighten. The other advantage of having a nut at the end is if you want to change the hilt in any way, if you want to put your own custom hilt on, no problem at all. Just undo it and fit your new handle or fit your new guard as you like. One final thing to say about the grip, actually, that I forgot to mention, is that nice little detail, we put wire in the recesses there of the sort of spiral groove that goes around the wood. We put some brass wire in there because why not? It didn't cost much more to do it, and it just gives the weapon a bit more of a classy look, I think. So, final thing to say about these weapons is that, whilst they have only just gone on sale on the HEMA shop website, which obviously I'll put the link to below, We've been using them in Scholar now for around 6 months. Okay, so they have had a lot of use, really a lot of use. We've been using them for regular training, for classes, obviously for sparring, and they've been used in tournaments, both against Regenyei Sabres, Hanway, Huttons, and they've been used obviously against each other. They've also been the official loan-out weapons for the Sabre tournament at Fight Camp, at which they had very tough contests, and they were really smashed around a lot. In fact, one of them used was my own example here, and they survived perfectly with no issues at all. They've got minimal edge damage during that time, despite the fact, as you will know, we edge parry in Sabre. There's really nothing to speak about. I've only had to file this blade to remove burrs a couple of times in 6 months. So they're good toughness, good springiness, no bends, no breaks, and they're fantastic. So there we go. Go and get yourself one if you're even remotely into military sabre. You won't regret getting one of these. They're fantastic value for money. And remember, at the HEMA shop, if you register as a club, you can get a discount as well, which makes them even better value. Great. Cheers, guys.